Welcome back to the podcast History of Our World. Chapter 43, The Peloponnesian War. The war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians was the greatest movement yet known in history, not only of the Hellenes, but of a large part of the barbarian world. I had almost said of mankind. For though the events of remote antiquity, and even those that more immediately precede the war, could not from lapse of time be clearly ascertained, yet the evidences which an inquiry carried as far back as was practicable to trust, all point to the conclusion that there was nothing on a greater scale, either in war or in other matters. That's Thucydides speaking, our chief source for much of the war, and in typical ancient Greek fashion, he is completely without hyperbole. This epic war, a series of battles between a group of ethnically and culturally similar people covering a landmass about the size of Scotland, this is the biggest thing ever. Just ignore that the Persian Empire contains a quarter of the world's population, or that the Zhou dynasty of China currently controls land about 10 times that of Greece, or that the Sumerians had already created the world's first book, or that the Egyptians had built giant freaking stone triangles. You get where I'm going with this? The Peloponnesian War, which really started back in episode 36, is an important time in ancient Greece, but Thucydides, come on, save the drama for Sophocles. But all joking aside, people really love to study the wars as an example of statecraft, tactics, and even as an ancient parallel to the Cold War. Except if we can transport ourselves back to the mid-400s BC instead of being distant observers, well then we can see this war as vicious, nasty, and just plain cruel. This is not the ancient Greek world's finest moment. But enough introductions, let's dive right in. If you recall from last time, Pericles had convinced Athens to pursue a strategy of hiding behind the long walls and using the navy to control the seas. Sparta might dominate the Attican landscape, but they couldn't stay too long. Every day their soldiers were away from home was a day when the Helots might start thinking about freedom again. Can't have that. So the Spartans could really only hold Attica for a month at a time before getting nervous about their home life. They engaged in a few skirmishes here and there, but it was really in 427 during one of those ventures up north that the Spartans kicked off the first of many atrocities during the war. At the behest of Thebes, Sparta is asked to attack Plataea, a tiny city with deep and loyal ties to Athens. If you don't remember this place, let me refresh your memory. Back in episode 32, when Athens was still finding its place in the world, they saved Plataea when Thebes became hungry for their land. Ever grateful, Plataea was the only one to send soldiers to support Athens at the Battle of Marathon. For that they later suffered Persian retribution, and at the end of the war, the city was the site of the final major land battle, and then the whole place was designated a holy site. But even that couldn't convince Thebes to just let it go, and they convinced the Spartans to join them in removing this Athenian ally. Plataea was not strong enough on their own to face Sparta, but Athens would surely have their back as they've always done, right? Well, as would be a theme throughout the war, the two main players might talk a big game, but sometimes they'd just not. Athenian help never came, and after a short siege that concluded towards the end of 427, the defenders of Plataea surrendered on condition that the Spartans treat them fairly. But as the city was taken, the defenders were rounded up and sent on trial, with the Thebans as prosecutors in the case, and the Spartans as the judges. In this bizarre mockery of justice, the Spartans hear the case as to why the Thebans first invaded. They claim their assault is just, as the Plataeans, being allies of Athens, are just as complicit in Athenian violence against their fellow Greeks. The Plataeans' defense is, "Are you kidding me?" In the end, the Spartans decide that the easiest way to decide the case is to ask each Plataean defender this question: have you rendered service to Sparta in this war? It's a very Monty Python bridge keeper kind of question. Saying yes is a lie, and off the bridge you go. So the Plataean defenders say no, hoping honesty is the best policy. Nope. The Spartans execute all the men, some 200 in total, and take the women and children away as slaves. The city is turned over to the Thebans, who in a childish act of "I'm not hungry anymore," decide they don't really want the city anyway, and raze it to the ground. Plataea was no more. Now around the same time, Mytilene, which is a city on Lesbos, had convinced other cities on the island to break away from the Athenian Empire. I mean the Delian League. Lots of places had become disenfranchised with Athens' heavy-handed ways, and Lesbos was no exception. As a ship-contributing member of the group, the island was no pushover, but they also knew what happened to those cities that bailed on the League before the iron floated, so to speak. After declaring their freedom, Mytilene sends word to Sparta asking for aid and support in exchange for their loyalty. Sparta agrees, and never delivers. Without that aid, the city lasts just a few months until the Athenians crank up the pressure and force surrender in 427. Afterwards, the assembly in Athens votes to do just what Sparta did to Plataea: kill all adult males and sell the women and children into slavery. A ship was sent out with those orders to the garrison on Lesbos. Except unlike Sparta, some politicians started feeling a bit sick in the gut. A new emotion took hold over many of them, which some attributed to heartburn, but others realized was guilt. For a city that Draco once called home, this punishment seemed a bit too draconian even for them. But the leading Athenian commander, Cleon, castigates his wimpy colleagues for their ambivalence, saying, "Not for the first time I realize how impossible it is for a democracy to govern an empire. You must realize that your empire is a tyranny, exercised over hostile and unwilling subjects. In this, consistency is more important than cleverness. Mytilene has wronged us, and the punishment is just. Let it stand as an example to others." However, guilt and cooler heads prevail, and by a narrow majority they vote to spare Mytilene. A second ship is launched with explicit instructions to race towards the island with all speed to deliver the new orders. Thucydides reports that the second ship surprisingly made it within moments of the previous vessel, thus saving the island. Oh, but before you think the Athenians have the moral high ground here, I must mention that this mercy only applied to the innocent. For all the rebel leaders, real and suspect, possibly a few hundred of them, they're still put to death. All of Lesbos' ships are seized, and all farmland becomes property of Athens, to be leased back to their original owners. So while life might be a bit tougher now, it could have been far, far worse. Those two conflicts are only the beginning of the story. Up north, the Athenian ally of Plataea refused to relinquish ties with the Corinthians, so the city was attacked and conquered. In Corcyra, the place where a lot of this all started, the political debate between democrats and oligarchs had taken a brutally violent turn. The city was in total civil war, with the democrats causing such terror in their opponents, many simply took their own lives rather than fight it out. In Delion, Athens sends an army to fight off both Corinth and Megara and loses nearly 1,000 men in a crushing defeat. At Pylos, off the western coast of Greece in 425, the Athenians score a naval victory against the Spartans, which leaves the Spartan army stranded on the island of Sphacteria, just a bit to the south. After setting up a blockade and starving them out, Athenian hoplites cautiously engage in battle, knowing full well that a cornered animal is far more dangerous. Except in a shocking twist, the Spartiates, some 120 full-blooded Spartan citizens, actually laid down their arms and surrendered, the first time they had ever done so. Big deal, you might say, but remember, this is the same place that sends you off to war with the expression, "come home with this shield or on it," referring to its use as a corpse carrier. This event puts a screeching halt to the conflict, as true-blooded Spartans are an incredibly valuable resource. So much so that Sparta actually offers to stop the war altogether if Athens would just release them. And maybe Athens would have done so under Pericles, but he isn't around anymore to make rational decisions, and the city decides to hold out for a sweeter deal. Give us more land and now we're talking. Sparta tentatively refuses to give in, but also pulls out of Attica, worried that any rash decision might imperil the lives of its VIPs. Now, while the Athenian countryside might be off limits, it doesn't stop the Spartans from heading up to Thrace and seizing the Athenian colony of Amphipolis in 424. The city was a critical projection of Athenian power up north, as it protected the valuable gold and silver mines nearby. If you're running an empire, you kinda want to make sure that those things are secure, so Athens scrambles to send an army up there to retake it. They're intercepted nearby in Chalcidice, where the Spartan commander Brasidas breaks through the Athenian fortifications using a Spartan siege machine designed to throw fire upon wooden defenses. Yes, the Peloponnesian War was so vicious that they even employed a primitive flamethrower. The fighting slogged on in all of its nastiness until the end of 424, when the two sides agreed to a year-long armistice, a break in the hostilities. Athens thought that they could use the time to build up their supplies and reorganize their forces. Sparta definitely knew that was Athens' plan all along, but then again they really needed to get back home and keep those helots in check. They'd have to leave the Athenians holding all the cards, especially since the 120 Spartiates were still being held hostage, and reports were coming back that some had already died. Well, any bad peace is preferable to a good war, but again, no one in the Greek world pays any attention to timetables. Whether done on purpose or without knowledge of this ceasefire, in the spring of 423 the Athenian allied town of Scione, up in Chalcidice, revolts, and asks Sparta's commander Brasidas for help. To his credit, sort of, someone finally comes through with promises of aid, and the Spartan sails to the city where he's welcomed as a hero. Enraged by this breach of the truce, the Athenians send Cleon to Chalcidice to put down the rebellion and engage the Spartans. The two war leaders meet near the captured town of Amphipolis, which the Spartans were using as a base. Cleon had with him about 1,200 Athenian hoplites, a couple hundred horsemen, and many more soldiers and light infantry from allied cities. Brasidas had nearly 2,000 Spartan hoplites, as well as lightly armored mercenary skirmishers. Cleon's initial strategy was good. Wait until more reinforcements arrived from Macedonia and totally crush the Spartans. But then Brasidas got bold. He began mobilizing his troops, an event witnessed by Athenian scouts who reported back this information. Cleon was unwilling to engage without reinforcements, so he ordered his troops to withdraw closer to the shoreline, giving the two armies some space. Bad move. As we've mentioned before, the strength of the Greek phalanx comes from the interlocking shields and giant spears of the hoplites. Frontal assaults are almost certainly doomed to fail, but from the side or back, the phalanx isn't designed for that maneuverability. While Cleon led his men in a tactical retreat, Brasidas quietly led an elite division of 150 Spartiates to close in on the Athenian center and attack. Exposed and confused, the center column fell fast. The Spartans quickly turned onto the next wing and were joined by the rest of their forces. The remaining Athenians under Cleon saw how easily their army crumbled and took off, but not before losing nearly 600 soldiers to the Spartans' handful. Yet in those casualty numbers are two important ones, for both Cleon and Brasidas died in the fighting. Cleon in retreat, Brasidas in battle. With the loss of two important leaders, you'd think the chance for peace was doomed. On the contrary, this was the loss of two great warhawks. Now is the perfect time for peace. In 421, the two sides met to hash out a deal, and here's the result. The Spartan hostages were finally freed. Amphipolis was returned. Athens promised to give up control of Pylos and not take revenge on the rebels in Chalcidice. Sparta would surrender Scione, and the two sides shall be best friends for 50 years. Got all that? Good. Actually, don't worry too much about it, because it doesn't matter. The deal was signed, but Athens really dithered on returning Pylos, not to mention other seized lands not even mentioned in the treaty. And when they got Scione back, they completely slaughtered its inhabitants as punishment for rebelling. Yep. It also became apparent that Sparta really sold out her allies to get back those hostages. Had not the other Peloponnesian cities fought and lost their own men? And for what reward in the end? So Corinth, Megara, and the cities of Boeotia refused to sign it, with Boeotia refusing to turn over an Athenian fort they had captured. This was the Peace of Nicias, also called the 50-year peace, and Athens came out way on top. The peace was supposed to last half a century, but it took just 4 short years for things to fall apart all over again. Argos, that neutral city on the Peloponnese, had declined to renew a 30-year peace treaty with Sparta, and sensing opportunity, sought to persuade disillusioned Peloponnesian states to revolt and form a new power. With clandestine support from Athens, Argos is successful in convincing some cities like Elis and Mantinea, located in Arcadia, to join this new alliance. Sparta tries to rectify the situation politically, but being unable to, goes off to war. In response, Argos calls in her new allies, including an Athenian contingent, to seize the city of Tegea. Their army totaled some 8,000 in all. On the way, they encounter the Spartans, with a massive force of 3,000 Spartiates, almost every fighting man the city could muster, and a few thousand from Tegea herself, and an additional 2,000 Neodemotes, a new hoplite division made of freed helots. Interesting. Were the Spartans going soft? Or were they just running low on troops? Either way, the two sides met near Mantinea in 418 for a ferocious battle. When the dust settled, the Spartans scored a decisive victory, after the ferocity of their attack caused much of the Argive army to flee. Argos formally surrendered and gave up on its New World Order plans. They were forced to renounce their ties to Athens, and the city became quiet once again. The peace had been broken, but the two sides were not rushing into battle as they had done earlier in the war. The conflict had taken a great toll on all of Greece, financially, mentally, and in human life, and yet there were still those pushing for more bloodshed. A young relative of Pericles especially had been very vocal about his reasons for fighting, and the people in power were listening. Actually, they were hopelessly in love with him, but if listening got his attention, sure, whatever worked. We'll talk about this guy next episode, but let's end on a non-violent note. Because out of this war comes someone else trying to make sense of it all. Not just the war itself, but everything. Life, virtue, knowledge. What does it all mean? The first we hear of him comes at Plataea, where his fellow soldiers discovered him lost in thought, standing in one spot completely motionless from sunrise to sundown. Then again at Delion, where he displayed exceptional valor, even as the Athenians turned and fled. And finally at Amphipolis, again showing courage during battle, even as he marched around barefoot. Lack of comfortable footwear aside, this man's actions would have a radical effect on Athenian society, and after being demonized by a city he worked so hard to improve, his life would end in one of the greatest tragedies in Western history. That man is Socrates. Next time on the podcast History of Our World.